Is Switch 2 the dawn of the final generation? Are traditional console generations of the sort that have defined decades of gaming about to be consigned to the dustbin of history? It's time to deep dive the fate of the generational cycle. Before we get into this, I have to credit an original video by friend of the channel RZB, whose excellent video linked in the description below inspired this one, which asks, are console generations a thing of the past? So first of all, I think we need to backtrack to understand why we've arrived at the point we have. Video game systems are, after all, pretty much unique in the tech world in terms of having these long, fixed generational cycles. If you look at home video, Betamax and VHS launched in the late 70s, and it wasn't until 1996 when DVDs were released. Blu-rays were launched in 2006, and Ultra Blu-rays first emerged in 2016. I suppose you could roughly equate these two generational cycles, and clearly there are new iterations of the technology, but clearly there's a substantial lag, with VHSs still being the medium of choice for many well into the 2000s, and DVDs and Blu-rays coexisting for an extraordinarily long time up until streaming gave the whole technological venture a run for its money. Similar patterns could be seen in the progression from vinyl to audio cassettes to CDs to MP3s. In the case of this technology, the quick emergence of an industry standard dictated the pace of change. Betamax was considered by many a superior technology to VHS, but had key failures, such as a limit of 1 hour per tape, so VHS won out. A few decades later, HD DVD also lost the format war to Blu-ray. The world is quite different now, of course, with streaming gradually nudging out physical media, but what we're seeing is that these formats achieve near total market penetration at each stage. This means even the most tech-averse people came to take the technology to heart, and these are the people who therefore are likely to cling to the old formats the longest. Without competition over formats, competition focused on other metrics, different forms of music players which were more powerful, more immersive, more portable, more user-friendly, or what have you. I think this comes down to video and audio players being quite limited in terms of the type of output required. Sure, every now and then there was a major leap forward, and the most significant leaps correlated with the most dramatic changes. DVD was a major change in the amount of storage offered, especially in proportion to the space the discs took up. Other sound and video formats benefited from recordability, support for different resolutions and screen dimensions, and so on. Still, the changes existed within a relatively limited field of options. If you want to watch Jaws, there's only so many ways you can change that experience up. Another technological field which has generations of a kind that have fallen into a completely different pattern is computing and mobile phones. Here there are generations, but these cycle through much quicker, with individual components being the key metric that have defined when an upgrade is required. Every new device offers the chance to have something slightly faster, sharper, more flexible. Technological changes also occur at a slightly faster clip. In the last few decades, we can think of the computer mouse and trackpad, touch screens, tablet computing, voice activation, facial recognition, let alone innumerable bespoke plugins such as game controllers and VR headsets, as well as software innovations of all kinds of different types. Here, there are different competitors and no market dominance. Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, and others have at different times surged ahead or lagged behind, but there is a constant competition. Much technology here is also driven by the early adopter market, with high-cost new technologies taken up extremely keenly and at significant markup, driving innovation and constant change, especially due to the pace of increase in efficacy of many components. Following Moore's law, that components would double in power every 2 years. While with audio and video the differences take a while to build up, with technology, the capacity to run ever more powerful programs soon renders past computers obsolete, and of course some manufacturers have been able to gild the lily by building planned obsolescence into their schedule. So then we come to video game systems, and for many years, consoles have fallen in between the two stools. On the one hand, there is huge potential for technology to constantly push the games forward, not just in terms of graphics, sound, and memory, but also in input technology and now AI enhancements. On the other hand, these are codified into platforms which are designed to allow publishers to produce games for the long term. Game development is a time consuming and fiddly enterprise and requires some level of confidence that the formats will remain stable. We have seen in the past consoles like the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation 3 struggling because they were difficult to develop for, and Nintendo, more than most companies, have a back catalogue of games designed for specific pieces of technology such as analog triggers and double screen that became different on newer versions of their tech. A console generation guarantees at least some degree of stability. Now, companies have tried to break from the console model before. The Sega Mega CD and Mega Drive 32X were bolt-on machines designed to approximate in the aggregate a 32-bit successor console, but so few people bought either individual add-on, let alone both, and the concept was not supported by Sega in Japan, but only by Sega in America extensively, so the idea sputtered and died fairly quickly, as did other similar innovations such as the 64DD disk system bolt-on to the N64, which never left Japan. A little more success has been found in recent years with the idea of mid-gen refreshes, non-essential console versions which still belong to the existing generation, but which offer the most dedicated users a slightly nicer play experience. Occasionally, these even have features bespoke to the newest versions, but of course, targeting a mid-gen console limits your audience base not just to a far smaller group of people, but to sell over a much smaller amount of time, since the very presence of a mid-gen refresh usually indicates that a machine is approaching the second half of its existence. However, console lifespans have not always been consistent in length. The Game Boy lasted nearly a decade before the Game Boy Color emerged, and arguably it was a full 12 years before the Game Boy Advance really took it over. Even then, the machine was backward compatible, meaning that Game Boy games published in 1989 were playable on current hardware through to the mid-2000s. Many consoles have been replaced sooner than they might otherwise have been because of the emergence of tough competitors. Fare thee well, GameCube and Wii U, while in some cases it's more strategy that seems to dictate the console's fates. Sony notably bases their appeal to users as being the offer of the most cutting-edge technology, and so it makes perfect sense that they would push to renew their consoles about as frequently as the market will allow, which seems to be around every 6 years. With a prevailing sense that generations are slowing down, they are likely to go a bit slower into the PlayStation 6 era, but probably not that much slower because ultimately their point of differentiation is that cutting-edge technology. Nintendo, on the other hand, benefits hugely from using what Gunpei Yokoi famously called seasoned technology, and so the longer they are using old tech, the more flexibility they have to maximize the kinds of games they can create. Even for Nintendo, though, there is a limit to their ability to sweat an existing generation. After the downright luxurious lifespan of the Game Boy, distended largely perhaps thanks to the success of Pokemon Red and Green, the Game Boy Advance was cut off abruptly when Sony entered the handheld space and Nintendo innovated heavily with the Nintendo DS. And there are other incentives to change. For one thing, they do make a significant profit off of hardware, and when they have reached saturation point in terms of the hardware market, it is generally time for them to consider something new. For another, they can test the patience of their devotees a little too long. For example, the release of the Nintendo 64 didn't lag all that much behind the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, and it was certainly more powerful and had many innovative ideas. But by the time the N64 had released, the initiative had been lost, and arguably it was a decade before Nintendo would seize that initiative back with a new console release in the form of the Wii. This soft pressure kind of glues the major players to a release cycle that is broadly consistent, and generally Sega and Nintendo, and now Sony and Microsoft, mirror each other's release schedules fairly tightly. After all, when these companies are both competing in the same market, the audiences are becoming ready for something new at similar times, and therefore there's a natural pressure to release successor consoles at similar times. That's not to say there haven't been attempts to buck the schedule. Sega notoriously trying to beat out Sony into the market in the 1990s and then being undercut by Sony by $100 on price, being an example of trying and failing to go early, while the Nintendo 64 shows the risks of going too late. By and large, though, the centre of gravity pushes releases towards the same kind of window. Of course, Nintendo have managed to separate themselves out from this, and it was with an explicit blue ocean strategy. The Wii appealed to different audiences and also had an audience of core Nintendo players who weren't as likely to be bothered by splashy graphics so much as the new Mario and Zelda games anyway. But while the Wii had phenomenal early success, it did not maintain the momentum, and the Wii U was pretty much a disaster for Nintendo. The Switch, meanwhile, although it was billed initially as a new home console, fell almost perfectly into the generational cycle of the handhelds, with the system releasing 6 years and a month after the Nintendo 3DS debuted. By bringing together the handheld and console units, Nintendo not only benefited in terms of games, but also took advantage of the natural rhythms of the market of these consoles. The common conception is that the Switch is a kind of offbeat subsection of a past generation, but in many respects it matches the historic trend of handheld games for being roughly 2 generations behind the current technology, with the Game Boy Advance releasing in the GameCube era but still able to play versions of Super Nintendo games, while the DS could play heavily adapted but still broadly functional versions of games that originally targeted the N64. In this way, Nintendo is still locked into a generational cycle, just a different one, and one that benefits from the fact that at the present there aren't any serious competitors in the handheld space. This brings us to the present day, where we can see the laws of the generational cycle are still kicking in quite strongly. Sure, the Switch has had an extremely long life, but that's probably because of the aforementioned lack of competition. But a new generation allows Nintendo to support new types of games, both first party and third party, and to profit off selling new hardware. Unlike with VHS and DVD, most users are not so wedded to their existing hardware that the lure of new technology doesn't have intrinsic appeal, and so the changes will likely take place. But is this a guarantee forever? Is the time coming when generations will cease to be? Looking back to our examples of audiovisual media players and computational tech, we can see two ways that generational thinking would break down. One would be the quick emergence of an industry standard. Nintendo at least will always resist this because they want to innovate. And the fact is that games intrinsically resist standardization in the way that films and television series generally don't. Ring Fit Adventure, Tetris 99, and Luigi's Mansion 3 are incredibly different from each other, but all released within the same year, and they will want to ensure that they continue to be able to push the boundaries. Of course, all these games use the same technology on Switch, and so the question becomes whether a core system could be supplemented by add-on technologies such as Pilates rings, virtual reality goggles, albeit cardboard ones, and other such innovations in order to appeal to the most people without necessarily changing the core device. This would lead to an industry standard set of technology, but let's stick a pin in that for now and look at other ways generational thinking might erode. This could be in the form of an iterative model, the iPhone model, if you will. I'm sure Sony will be very happy to constantly release new hardware and gradually phase out earlier models, but this has its flaws too. It's much more cost effective to produce in bulk than in relatively small amounts, and so prices would have to trend upward to accommodate the costs associated with lower output. This would make the company less competitive in turn, and so ultimately they're unlikely to move in this direction unless they can find a way to be extremely modular in their changes, so they can literally do an adaptation like the 2019 revision to the original Switch, where it wasn't really advertised, but they just started producing a Switch with a slightly better battery life. There's also the question of how essential people find the innovations, and this is where the generational cycle risks running into the ground. With the Super NES to Nintendo 64 leap, there was very clearly an absolute revolution in terms of gameplay possibilities from the dawn of polygonal 3D gaming. But the differences are much more subtle in the PlayStation 4 to PlayStation 5 jump, and this is complicated by two other factors. First, the need for people to have additional cutting edge technology such as 4K televisions to benefit significantly, and secondly, the fact that component prices are escalating fast at a time when the cost of living is rendering consoles less affordable. I've noted before that while consoles as a whole are generally fairly well protected from demand hits due to cost of living problems, that's talking about the whole market. In this case, Sony has only a subsection of the market, and if they pitch their wagon too far into the high-end territory, the land they'd be ceding would be to Nintendo's lower price mass market offering. Moreover, as time goes by in audiovisual terms, diminishing returns are likely to be the order of the day. That's not to say there isn't a long way still to go. Games still don't generally look like Pixar movies yet, although they're not that far off, and loading times is still a major concern. But ultimately, these concerns have less box office appeal to new consumers than opening up a completely new set of possibilities for play. It would suit Sony, therefore, to ultimately settle in as offering an industry standard, top of the market machine, equivalent to their Blu ray players and televisions, which just play a huge range of PlayStation games at an incredible standard with perhaps only very minor tweaks. It might suit Microsoft to seed this space in order to focus on Game Pass and other similar ventures. I think, though, we're a way away from this yet. The financial pressures to iterate and the risks with an iterative model, such as the economies of scale considerations, still mitigate against Sony going down this route. But I suspect, nevertheless, that these console generations are closer to the end than the beginning. Now, that said, a word of caution, there are still many further steps games can take towards realism. We are a long way from Star Trek style holodecks, and I'm sure the time will eventually come that the PlayStation 11 will have a fair case to make for itself. But just like with VHS to DVD's transition, it may start to take a more decisive leap than just slightly better lighting and a few seconds faster loading to push new technology. And so we could see a lull, a period where even very advanced gaming technology makes games as they have traditionally been played an incredible experience, but before a disruptive new technology makes upgrading an inevitability. To be clear, I think this change would still be a long way off for Sony. I expect PlayStation 6 and likely PlayStation 7 to come out in fairly predictable time schedules, barring major changes in the industry affecting their decision-making process. There's still a lot to be gained from being at the top of the market, and especially if they can head towards being an industry standard. However, an industry standard situation for Nintendo would be disastrous. They are not a hardware company or a software company, but they are explicitly in the hardware software business. Their business model is to create new entertainments using technology in surprising and different ways to engage people in play. That doesn't necessarily mean games, though games are the primary expression of this in recent decades. If an industry standard of technology comes in, yes, their games are great, so they would doubtless be successful, but it would cut the legs off the hardware side of their business and eat a lot of the creative seed corn that makes the game so wild to begin with. And that's why I don't see them abandoning the generational approach anytime soon. However, they do need insurance. One insurance policy which we've seen them explicitly talk about in recent times is the development of their broader IP-related activities, films, theme park attractions, merchandising, and so on. This we can expect to continue, and they will likely hope that by the time the Switch 2 is long in the tooth, this will have established itself as a much more secure part of their business, one that can take the strain if there are bumpy periods in their console generational cycles, which, let's face it, is inevitable in the longer term. Secondly, though, they need to innovate. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean superseding the Switch format. After all, Switch has its own little niche for the time being, but the last 8 years has seen a steady trickle of market competitors in the handheld space, and even though none of them has given the Switch any major competition yet, the law of averages suggests that eventually someone will crack the code and do what Sony did in the 90s, breaking into an apparently tight console space with an upstart competitor. Nintendo's only choice, therefore, is to change the game. Double screen, touch screen, shoulder buttons, analog triggers, motion controls, VR. Nintendo has always experimented with the new and surprising, or at least the old and withered and surprising, and this will ultimately be where they need to go. It could well be that they can do this using bolt-ons to the Switch or the Switch dock. I still think the apparent presence of a secondary USB port seems to suggest that there is a benefit to be had from bolting accessories on, and Nintendo particularly thrived in the accessory space on the Wii. But the core system will also need to change if they're to keep ahead of the competition. That blue ocean needs to be maintained. With the Virtual Boy DS and the Switch, they took the approach of launching parallel systems to their existing models. Where these systems were successful, such as the DS and Switch, they cut their losses fairly quickly on the older systems. Where they were unsuccessful, such as with the Virtual Boy, they returned to their old successful models, in this case, the Game Boy. The Switch 2 is in a strong position to launch at this point. It has a good chance to make big inroads into the market quickly, and there is yet to be any clear upstart successor. By 2027 or 2028, when new technology is launched by Sony and perhaps Microsoft, they will hope to be very well established, such that all but the most graphically intensive new titles will be able to find a home on Switch 2. They will also hope that even if they launch at a more expensive price, they will be able to have cheaper models such as the Lite 2, which will make the console a brilliant entry point for casual consumers all the same. However, from the 2030s, I think they will need to consider how to diversify their Switch lineup technologically. Switch 3 is an option, of course, and one they may take up, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them stretch the bounds a little more. VR goggle switches, models of the Switch which use vastly different technology at their core. I could even see them looking to move back into their toy-oriented roots. Sure, the Mario Kart Live Home Circuit game didn't seem to set the world ablaze, but let's assume that 1 in 10 of these kinds of innovations pay off for Nintendo, and eventually they're going to find something that helps guarantee their future. Until then, I think Nintendo may try to extend these generations out. 9 years for the Switch 2 isn't inconceivable as long as they can keep pushing it into new markets successfully without encountering any rearguard competitors, though of course the baseline likelihood of another console matching the vast triumph of the original Switch has to be relatively low, so this far out we're probably looking at a somewhat shorter lifespan for Switch 2. But when they make that next pitch way off in the distant future, I think they're going to need to have something more compelling than just graphics to offer. For more on Nintendo's economic decisions, why not check out this deep dive into the way they approach pricing? Meanwhile, do check out the Patreon, like, subscribe, share, and comment, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.